Welcome to the Startup of the Year podcast, where each episode we showcase exciting new companies from around the world. This podcast is produced by Established, creators of the Startup of the Year program. Established is focused on helping organizations with their innovation, startup, and communication strategies.
Hello and welcome back to the Start of the Year podcast. I'm Frank Gruber, your host. I'm also the co-CEO of Established and managing partner at Established Ventures. I'm excited today to have my guest here. She's a pioneer investor, entrepreneur, and an author of a new book, Venture Everywhere. And her name is Jenny Feeling. And she's the co-founder and managing partner of Everywhere Ventures and an early stage investor backing global founders all over the world. She's formerly the managing director at Techstars, where she mentored and invested in lots of companies, hundreds probably, as well as started her own two mobile software startups, and then eventually moved over to venture. So welcome, Jenny. Thanks so much for being here, and excited to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Frank. I feel like you and I go way back, so it's always fun to see you again.
Absolutely. I appreciate doing it. And yeah, it's been a while since we last caught up, but I'm excited about your book. It's really, easy read. And you got these like little vignettes you can kind of jump in and out of. So I really enjoyed that. But I love how you weave your story of just your background. So let's start with the book because it's front of mind for me. Your book, Venture Everywhere, it focuses on global entrepreneurship and shares your inspiration in writing it, kind of in the book. So I wanted you to kind of like share some of that a little bit. You don't have to tell the whole story, like leave a little bit for folks to go get the book, but a little bit of inspiration of what you brought, why you brought this to the world, and what you want readers to get out of it.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, the book is about global entrepreneurship and really what we can all learn from founders building companies around the world and all, far from the globe, Silicon Valley. So I interview founders, in multiple continents and multiple countries. And as I interviewed these entrepreneurs, and really as I've met these entrepreneurs over the last 10 to 15 years of traveling to over 100 companies, I noticed some common themes and through lines in their stories and that have affected and really, influenced their perspective on how they see the world and how they've built their companies and how they live their life. So in the book, I call it the everywhere mindset, and I kind of break down some of the principles. But really, the book is about, having the courage to chart your own path. And so you kind of asked about the inspiration. The book starts with me visiting my grandparents in Brooklyn and hearing my grandmother just going on this trip to Europe. And I convinced, her and our family that I should go with her for like months, on this like crazy journey. My grandmother was very eccentric. But she was a real influence on me and my grandparents, who were all kind of entrepreneurs and not tech entrepreneurs, but, people that had forged their own businesses. My grandfather owned fruit stores throughout Brooklyn. And just seeing kind of the resilience that you need to build a business and, just the lifestyle that they had, but then also kind of the freedom that they had was very inspirational for me. What's funny is that I kind of went the opposite way. I very traditional. I went to law school. I worked in finance. And then when I finally had the guts to start a company, I think I reflected back on just that kind of that nature of, many people in my family who had decided to, become entrepreneurs, maybe sometimes out of necessity. So yeah, it was fun. It's a very personal book. You learn a lot about me, but really, the message is around, the incredible entrepreneurs who are just building, massive companies around the world.
I love that about this book. You really do share a lot, and I think it helps, connect better with you, but also connect better with the reader and share the stories that you're sharing. I love the stories about your grandparents too. I thought they were great. And so let's rewind a second though. You talked about the everywhere mindset. Can you just explain that a little bit more and like how founders can develop it?
Yeah, I think sometimes, when we grow up in the States or we grow up, in around Silicon Valley, we can be very, US centric, or we kind of see, things just unfold for us. And I think in the world that we live in, especially right now, this kind of volatile world, we have to all, develop these, some of these characteristics that help us get through our day and build our companies. So I talk about things like building conviction and how do you do that, especially when the world is against interest you. Or a fun one of the everywhere mindset is this idea of moxie, which in many cultures, is just not looked upon favorably, right? It's like having that chip on your shoulder, being a little salty. But the truth is, like, some of the best entrepreneurs, that is, they've had to develop that or they have that. And I think there's stuff that we can all learn from those people. We don't, even in the US, we're kind of taught like you need to be liked and you need to, and I'm trying to break some of those things down and say, like, we're much more complex than that, right? Like, sure, you need to, you need to be able to get along with people and be in the world, but like being liked may not be the characteristics that's going to drive your business, your career, your life to success. And so let's, kind of look at the other side of some of these characteristics.
Absolutely. And there's certain, like you said, certain regions that moxie is just built in inherently. Like they just have this swagger, about how they go about things and don't, not giving up. So definitely seen it as well. And wanted to talk a little bit more about maybe, we're talking about a lot of places outside of Silicon Valley. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about launching a startup outside of one of the, major tech hubs, Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, that you've seen?
Yeah, I think for a long time, I mean, we can all agree that we all believe that innovation was coming from everywhere, but capital was very constrained. And you've seen in the last few years that trope has really been exploded, right? In many verticals, it's actually better to build your business in other ecosystems, right? We saw that with cryptocurrency, especially with some of the harsh regulations in the US, until more recently, that the best cryptocurrency companies were building in Singapore, they were building in Switzerland, they weren't building here. We also just saw kind of the distribution of cash, right? And that, other developing ecosystems, whether they're in the US or elsewhere, were starting to attract cash, and that people in those ecosystems who, have made money have started to think about, the next generation and supporting that generation. So I think it just takes a long time to develop that, that next generation and that mindset of like, hey, I want to, help out, the next innovators. And so we really started to see that in places like New York. When I started my company in 2007, it was a pretty grim place to run a company. And now you think, wow, second largest ecosystem. It's so amazing. It took a long time to develop. So what's cool about, the book and some of these locations is these didn't happen overnight. So, I profile a founder in Brazil and one in Mexico and one in Nigeria. Like it took a long time for these ecosystems to come about, but it's a very exciting moment as, capital starts, really flowing in those places.
Yeah, and that's really funny to think about New York not being like thought of as like a hub for innovation when it's, one of the larger
I mean,
hubs.
people don't believe me. I was literally in 2007, there was no co-working spaces, there was no venture funds, and everyone said, if you're going to build a software company, you got to go to the West Coast. And I kind of looked around and was like, I don't know, seems like some good raw material here. We have a lot of capital. It's not venture capital, but we have, hella rich people and we have Wall Street and we have real estate. And so there's a lot of, wealthy people that can support startups. We have every multinational, in New York. We've got, incredible universities where amazing talent is flowing. So, we had a lot of the building blocks, but people still insisted, you want to build a software company, go to Silicon Valley. So again, it didn't happen overnight, but brick by brick, entrepreneurs, started digging their heels in and saying like, no, this is a great place. And sure, I'll fly out to Silicon Valley and make sure that I'm like well networked, but I'm going to build my company here. And so now we're just seeing that, all over the world, which is super cool. Yes, build your network, in tech hubs, but live where you want, and run your company where you want. And I think that that's now really possible.
Yeah, I agree. And it's taken what, almost 20 years, I feel like, to get to that point. But it's really fun to watch it evolve. And you shared some success stories. You mentioned a couple places a moment ago. Can you share like one success story that kind of embodies the whole everywhere philosophy? Like one that sticks out the most? You're like, this is like the perfect poster child.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, but one of the stories I love is an entrepreneur who grew up in a small town in Pakistan. And, his family, had not been educated and they run like a small shop, in their town. But they always wanted their children to kind of have a better life. We hear this story all the time. So the founder at the age of, I don't know, like 16 or 17 gets a scholarship to UCLA. Like he's never even left his town, never been on an airplane and shows up in Los Angeles, right? And so, just imagine that cultural, I mean, crazy, but he really thrives and he makes friends and he, just like puts himself out there. He has some setbacks, but, fast forward, that founder ends up moving, to the Middle East, and he starts a company called Kareem, and Kareem goes on to be one of the huge success stories in the Middle East, gets sold to Uber for $3 billion. And like, think about where he came from and what the drive was to succeed and what it was like to come to the US, at that moment, and just, such a different experience. So I love highlighting those founders who are not scared to get on a plane, who are not scared to interact with other cultures, which is a really, part of the theme of the book is really about having empathy and awareness for other cultures and realizing that the world is increasingly more interconnected. Now, these founders that I profile in the book, they learn that out of necessity. Many have to flee their war-torn countries or countries that don't have a lot of resources. So for them, it's necessity. And I think for folks in the US, many of the people reading the book, there's a lot we can all learn from that, especially in this moment, which is a kind of interesting moment in US history.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask that as a follow-up. How do you see that changing now that we've got a little bit more attention to, our borders and keeping them a little tighter? And, obviously we're sending some folks back to different countries, and our whole program around visas has gotten a little tighter too. So I wanted to get your take on that. And then
I'm
actually,
taking,
I want to ask that, and
yeah,
then I want to also, before I forget, ask you, what's the reverse of us, like somebody coming to LA from Pakistan without seeing anything like that from our perspective, if we were from the US going somewhere else? So those are my two follow-ups.
Um, I mean, I'm taking a really opposite perspective of what's happening right now, in the administration or kind of the ethos of being more isolationist. I'm saying, look back, like, maybe 20 years ago, if you were working at a company, maybe you were working mostly with people in the US or maybe in your town or city. I mean, what company right now doesn't have international clients that you need to interact with or people on your team that are in other countries? And if you can't develop the skill set to interact with them and understand, like that's just such a fundamental skill that maybe you didn't need all those years ago. So, I'm taking an opposite stance, which like we're living in a global world. When we meet founders, many of them are thinking about global markets. They're not just thinking about, selling into one place. And I think, we need to change our DNA in the US and really kind of think about, what that means to be global. So, yeah, I'm taking a very opposite stance to what you're hearing. And I just think that reflects the lives that, that we live and the technologies that we use and the people that we interact with. It's just very different than it was before.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So my second question I didn't want to forget was, okay, this founder comes into LA, goes to UCLA, never,
Yeah.
stepping foot in the US. What's the opposite of that for from our perspective? Like, is there one? Like, what would it be like for us to go? I don't know. Have you ever seen the reverse of that from a founder in the US?
Well, when I started my first company in 2007, my co-founders were from Denmark, and we had an office in Denmark. We had our tech team in Denmark, and I spent half my time there, and I, very quickly had to learn, Danish culture, which was quite different than the US. I mean, I won't go into all the stereotypes, but many of them were true. And that was just a very different way to run a startup. And it was very challenging for me, right? So coming from like the New York go mindset, everyone's working all the time, right? So, work to live versus live to work. I mean, maybe my priorities weren't right, but that was my perspective. I'd come from banking. I worked in law. I grew up in New York. And that just wasn't how, that community operated. And so it was a real wake up call that, calling people at 7 o'clock at night was really not going to make me their favorite person. So, so I think that we all, learn these lessons in different ways. For me personally, it was having a global company and just being shell shocked that the world didn't operate this well. And even if you kind of intellectually understand that the cultures are different, it was like I still wanted to run the company this way. And that was really at odds with many of our employees.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I think that's a great example, actually. Not one I would have thought of either. So and you obviously lived it. So going back to your founding of companies, now you went from founding a couple of companies to investing, and I wanted to understand, coming from that founder mentality, how has that shaped your investment, philosophy as you've kind of built your practice out?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started my company, the thing that I lacked really wasn't capital. We bootstrapped before we raised. It was really resources, mentorship, support. And, fast forward all these years, and I think there's a lot more offered for startups, but I still every day talk to a company and they feel, or a founder, and they feel, alone, and they feel like they don't know, they get so much information, thrown at them. They don't know who to trust and which way to go. So when I decided to go on my own, I really wanted to make our firm about something different, which was about, again, we write checks, but really what we do is we've created a very robust community that supports founders. And it's not just my co-founder and myself, it's this community of 500 founder and operators who are all LPs, people that give us money, and they're, supporting this larger portfolio. It's the only way that we can do it. But I wanted to kind of create something that felt more like a community. And, I learned a lot when I was working at Techstars on, how you can invest, quite quickly into a lot of startups using this community model of support, right? And mentors. And that's really what Techstars was built on. And so I extrapolated some of the things there that I thought really worked into the ethos of our fund.
That's great. And as you look at startups, what's the most important kind of quality that you see in a startup or a founder that makes you, okay, if they've got, you mentioned a bunch of them in the book, you've got a bunch that you've listed out, but what's the one that kind of, makes it a yes for you?
I think honestly, like running a startup is such a slog. You need to have resilience and you need to be able to get through the hard times. And maybe it seems cliche, but the truth is like we've backed, a number of founders that I believe gave up too early. Now, I get there's opportunity cost if something isn't working. Like, you're living your life and you've got to, pursue what you think's going to work. But I also think there's something really important about sticking things out. And quite honestly, if you look at some of, the best success, companies in the US, many of them were pivots, right? And so what would have happened if, Slack, which started as a game, didn't turn into Slack? Like, I don't know, I live on Slack and many startups do. And so just think about there's dozens of those examples of just, huge companies that started very differently. And so I think those founders, one of the things that they showed was this ability not to grow up, to give up. They just kept on persevering. And they just kept on learning, taking in information and data, and then figuring out where the path was.
Yeah, that's great. Now, Everywhere Ventures has backed 300 companies, which is amazing. Congratulations, that's a lot. And I'm impressed by that. I wanted to understand how you got it started because it's always, you started a fund, which is different than a startup. I mean, it is a startup, but it's a little bit different setup. I wanted to understand at what scale were you able to kind of get that going? And obviously, you didn't start saying, okay, we're going to invest in 300 companies. So, can you talk us through that effort and how that's kind of progressed, and then kind of the
Yeah, I think one of the commonalities in my history is that I really like this idea of bootstrapping and testing things out. So my first startup, as I mentioned, I was working full time at a bank before I started, and started my company in my living room. Kind of did the same thing at Everywhere, which is I was working full time at Techstars and kind of came up with this thesis. And it just seemed like I was going to have the ability to both, do the day job, which I absolutely loved and was learning a ton, and kind of prove out through a proof of concept fund, whether this thesis was going to work. So really ran two funds while I had a full-time job, nights and weekends, and kind of took a lot of the learnings over, my entrepreneurial career and my investing career and put them into action. And then, just tried to see if it was working. I mean, we had a very bold thesis, which many, limited partners and other investors don't really believe in, which is the high volume investing. And we just made an argument that it could actually work. But then we had to prove it out. So we raised a small proof of concept fund. And I'm very proud to say that, a number of years later, that fund we've already returned for its 2018 vintage, kind of proving that, small checks at low entry prices, when you have enough diversification, can outperform the market, which we've done. So yeah, that was the humble origins of really just like testing and iterating. I mean, I'm a product person. I built 2 companies, and I like to make sure that things are working before, kind of going full force. And especially when you're taking money from other people. I always think it's very bold when I hear about these firms that kind of come out of nowhere. And, people are giving them money to learn. I wanted to get some of that learning under my belt before I did that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. You do hear about these splash, I just raised $150 million, and they come out of the woodwork, and you're like, wow, that's impressive. What are you gonna, how's that going to work? And so I wanted to understand, like, your kind of minimal viable product, right? Your test fund, I guess you call it, or proof of concept. What did that look like, and how many was enough to show the scale? Like, because you're now you showed it. Now you've got 300 companies, but you didn't start there. Was it 30 companies that, or what was that looking like, just for people's kind of?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's funny that, everywhere is global, because the first fund, we just were focused on New York.
Mhm.
And we rallied 50 LPs that were all founders who had built companies. Many of them were angel investors, and they got a lot of deal flow. They had a lot of knowledge about running companies, and some of them had a lot of time to dedicate to us. Yeah, so we kind of got 50, and the idea was to invest in 50. So it was kind of this like 1-to-1, and that's exactly what we did. So it took us about a little over 2 years, 2.5 years to invest that fund. We invested in 50 companies that were all building in New York, and we wanted to kind of prove the thesis that if we had local folks in New York also supporting them, that we could kind of provide something that would be beneficial to the startups and beneficial to us, in that, like, pretty much no one would cut us out of a deal if they knew that this community was behind our fund, right? So yes, you get the general partners, but you get kind of access to all these other founders. And we wanted to see if that was true. Yeah, we proved that out with 50. It seemed to be going quite well, and we're able to raise our next fund. So yeah, we've had, I'm grateful for the support that we've had just from, many founders and builders. And I think that's what distinguishes us from many institutional funds.
Great. That's great. Really interesting approach. And I think, just shows your kind of community background and just turning that into something everyone can kind of get behind. All right, moving along. It's a lot about your fund. What's the biggest lesson you've learned from that, now you've invested in 300 companies, investing at that scale? And obviously you mentioned it works, and you've seen that with your first fund. Aside from that, is there anything else you've learned or pulled out?
Yeah, I mean, building community is hard. You've done it, Frank, quite successfully, but I'm sure it doesn't happen overnight. And I get people, call me all the time and ask me, "Hey, I'm building this new community. Can you give me some points?" And my biggest point is just like, have some time, because communities are not built overnight, right? It takes a lot of, blood, sweat, and tears, and you have to experiment and try different things. And, quite honestly, we've tried a number of different iterations of keeping our community together, engaging them, that just haven't worked. And I think, you can't get discouraged and just say like, oh, community-driven venture capital doesn't work. You have to say like, okay, that iteration wasn't super successful for this community. Let's try something else. I think, related to that, whenever you're building something, you want to put in scalable systems. And so, we were very beholden to certain tools. Well, it turns out when your LP base and community base is, around the world, they might not want to use those tools. So to be more, concrete, we run our whole fund really on Slack and like founder communication and, everything. We have a very engaged community. We exchanged over 1 million Slack messages, and no cat memes, like all founder resources. And but many communities internationally just don't want to use Slack. They want to use WhatsApp. And so I think, at the beginning we kind of fought it and said like, hey, this is where the action is. Like, we can't have multiple communities. And then we kind of like scratched our head a little bit, and we're like, you know what, like that we need to be like more respectful of how things work in other places. And so if that, crew in Africa wants to have like, this great WhatsApp discussion, then let's encourage that. So obviously it makes things challenging for us to have different platforms. I'm sure, you have some of this as well, but we see it as a challenge, but also an opportunity for us to learn. So that's just like one concrete example of something that like we tried one way, didn't exactly work, and we kind of pivoted to something that works really well.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it's makes extra work, right? Now you've got to manage these two different communities on different
Yeah.
platforms. But I can see where that's the case. I mean, not Slack isn't for everyone. We've seen that even, just running different types of communities on it. And all right, let's move along here though. Let's talk about founders that are raising. You've talked to probably thousands of them, especially in the last couple of years. Capital the last couple of years has been it's there. It's just not been as easy. Let's just put it that way, right? So in that climate, what is, what do you, I guess, advice would you give to these founders that are trying to raise, have been raising for a while, as they try to pull a round together?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a case of, kind of what we call the have and have not. So, raising capital the last couple of years has been somewhat binary, where certain founders come out of the gate and they're just able to raise these mega rounds, even in this environment, and it happens quickly. And sometimes it's not just because they're the who's who or they're in Silicon Valley. Like, honestly, sometimes it's just the vertical they're in. I mean, it's like unclear to me exactly. But it's very disheartening, I think, for founders, right? Because they see their friends, they see, folks in building other companies, and some are just able to raise off the bat and some are not. So I think it's really hard. So my practical advice is like when we are in these, intense times within tech, so like not 2020, 2021 in the heyday boom days, you just have to, think about things differently. And so I tell founders, like, if you needed, if your pre-seed round got done talking to 25 investors, like your seed round, you may need to talk to 75. And so get ready for that and reposition your mindset of what it's going to be. And then just like do the math. So you're going to have to do more top of the funnel, build a larger investor pipeline document, talk to more people, get more introductions. And so just take the problem that's in front of you, not, what you thought it was or what you want it to be. And so I think there's just a lot of practical ways to deal with the volatility. But I really feel for founders right now because it's just very confusing.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of on the same line, like what are some of the mistakes that you've seen early founders make when they're, I guess, raising or just in general?
I think in this market, you need to think that whatever capital you're raising is the last money you'll get. And that obviously goes very much against, you know, capital fueling your business and raise every 2 years or every 18 months and, go big or go home. I think you have to, literally take that cash that you raise and have a few scenarios planned, right? Have some backups. Like what would happen if, and really run some parallel paths, right? Like how can we understand what the levers are to get to break even while not running a cash flow, positive business at this moment, right? But understanding what you would need to do and what the milestones are, right? If this isn't working, by June, then this is what we're going to do, right? And I think that many founders, being optimists, and I love it, are just not really planful in that way. Like, of course it's going to work. So I tell every founder the day they close that round, start scenario planning that's it. And what will your business do? And what will you do? And will you be able to make fast decisions, be that high cadence founder who can take the data, act on it, as opposed to, just putting it off. No one likes to fire people. No one likes to admit that their products aren't working. So really kind of have those milestones set out for yourself at the beginning.
Yeah, that's great. Great point. And it really shows, you got to be built for resilience. And that's something you emphasize with founders. So can you talk a little bit more about maybe how you become more resilient through those ups and downs? Is there anything they can do to help position? I mean, obviously that mindset is important, right? Like right from the get-go, you're saying mindset, like this could be it, plan that way. Is there anything else they can do to kind of strengthen their position, I guess you could say?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One is make sure you have like really good sounding boards who are not just, kind of blowing smoke your
Mhm.
way, but are, telling you the truth. And I mean, that's one of the things we kind of pride ourselves at everywhere is that we don't sugarcoat things. Sometimes people say it's tough love, but we think it's love, love. And so, yeah, just having people that are seeing. I mean, I think why we're at an interesting perch at everywhere is that because we're so high volume, because we see so many deals, like we can just distill patterns over time. So like lean on us, be like, what are you seeing in the market? Like I love when founders are like, hey Jenny, what are seed rounds, in North Carolina getting done? And we can like jam on like what's happening on the ground. And I think that's kind of our advantage. So make sure that you've got real sounding boards. And I'd say, one of the other things is like, you're going to have tough times. There's no startup that, has not had real trials and tribulations. And you have two ways to deal with it. One is to like put your head in a hole and pretend that it's not happening, meaning not communicating with your team, not communicating with your investors. And the other is to hit it head on and just, come and be really forthcoming, and hopefully those people will be able to support you. And we see it all the time. I mean, once we stop getting consistent updates, we know, oh, something is going wrong in the company. It should honestly be the opposite. When things aren't going well, I should be hearing from that founder all the time, because we have tons of resources. Like we can help. We have a perspective. And I guess it's human nature not to want to deal with things that aren't, working, or failure. But I don't know. I feel like you need to lean in the other way. I always think about that Winston Churchill quote about like success is walking from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. And so I think like, not everything's going to work out, but if you can like hold your head high and just like put it out there, then I think there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's a great quote, by the way. Really good for this, for talking about this as well. But that I think the fear, right? Like it's a fear of like, oh gosh, I've got to tell my investor that I'm not doing well, and the fear of what could happen, I guess, is I think what drives that, right? Like they don't want to.
But I mean, we're investors. Like we
Right.
have a good model that's resilient and fortified, and we understand, that most of our companies are not going to work out. And you, as a founder, have to understand that this is our business model. And we're professional. I've been doing this for a decade. There's nothing I haven't seen. But when I see bad behavior of, people not being transparent or sharing this stuff, like that to me is very unfortunate and unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. You guys can help too. You got a bench that can help solve some of these problems. Probably you've seen them all. So great advice there. Let's switch gears and talk about venture a little bit more. It's definitely evolving, and things like AI and other emerging technologies may impact it some way or change it a little bit. How are you thinking about that? Like whether it be on the, first off, the way on this spectrum of like AI could replace venture. We've heard that kind of thing rattling around out there in the news a little bit. And then you've got the other side of it of like, no, it won't. And, there's going to constantly be this, all the new technologies are going to continue to evolve and do things faster, and they'll need venture more later. So maybe just talk about the things you're hearing, I guess, from a futuristic kind of perspective, and maybe how they might impact both venture and I guess future companies.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously seeing the rise of the super scrappy startup that, needs one or two engineers and, a bunch of people that can use Cursor and some, great tools, and maybe that's all they need. So I think one of the exciting things is that hybrid models or hybrid trajectories are really popping up. So maybe a company will bootstrap till they really find product market fit, like, they would be able to raise an A, and like maybe they'll go raise then. So that really wasn't in the lexicon, I think, until recently. Like if you were a Series A investor and you looked at a company that hadn't raised before, but they were doing all this revenue, you'd be suspect. You would wonder what was wrong. I think we need to celebrate those stories and really kind of change our perspective on what it means to bootstrap or just run your business a little bit differently. So I do think the future of venture capital is going to be, just look very different. I just don't think it's going to look one way. It might be that you do the opposite, which is that you raise a pre-seed round, you raise 1.5 million and maybe you never raise again, right? You figure out, how to grow exponentially. So I think AI is, great tailwinds for, many of these models that maybe weren't so prevalent a few years ago. And so I'm excited about that. In terms of like me having a job, like, listen, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I go where the opportunity is. So it doesn't bother me. Like if people don't need venture capital, great. Like I'll do something else. Like I don't think that most, certainly not all of companies should be raising venture anyway. So, at my heart, I'm an entrepreneur. And so I think the entrepreneurs, need to take their best options. So probably not going away tomorrow, but probably changing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think we've got a little bit of runway here on the venture side. We're still working the kinks out on AI. As you know from working with it, some of the things you try to do don't always turn out. So there's a little bit of time there, but wanted to go back to the book a little bit because we've talked about other things. The book is really interesting. It's set up with each chapter being a different country and kind of telling a story. And wanted to, you got Mexico, India, UK, Australia, Spain, China. You've been all over. You've been everywhere. Um,
100 countries.
yeah, I know it's crazy. I'm still working on getting to the 50 states. So it's pretty impressive from that perspective. And I just want to understand like all of these different places is which, and I don't want you to, it's like picking your favorite child here, but like, what's your favorite kind of story or from a specific country? Like, is there like a country that you're just like this country? I mean, Mexico is where you went first, but what are the other countries that you've been to, I guess, and what's the one that kind of resonates the most with you that you wanted to maybe share here?
I don't know. I mean, listen, when I started the book, I came up with a list of probably like 45 and worked with my editor to narrow it down. So it'll be Venture Everywhere
Book two.
Part 2.
You got book two.
Yeah. I mean, there was a chapter on Japan that didn't make it. There was a chapter. Yeah. So lots of chapters. I would say one of the most kind of fascinating ones to me was a trip that I took to Saudi Arabia. So that was just very unexpected. I never thought in my lifetime that I would go to Saudi Arabia. I never thought that I would kind of see the things that I saw there. And so, I'm not saying it was my favorite, but like culturally, it was very eye-opening, spending time there, certainly as a woman. But what's amazing is just that the culture, or the society is changing so fast. And so when you're there, you kind of feel like a fly on the wall of like, watching with curiosity of like where they're going. And I was just like, I was so fascinated. Every conversation, every place I went, it was just like my eyes were super wide open. And there was such a juxtaposition of kind of an old country and culture, and then a new one, and how those people were living side by side and, dealing with change. And I just thought it was like absolutely fascinating. So that was a highlight. I took that trip actually early 2024. I think it was the last country that made it into the book. But that was a fascinating trip and one that I just never thought I would be able to experience.
And fairly recently. So that's changing, continuing to change. So that's actually a really great example. And obviously,
Yeah.
we'll continue to see that evolve. All right, let's talk about your career a little bit more. And maybe, I know in the book you kind of set it up as like those trips you took with trip you took with your grandmother, right? Like kind of setting up that was a pivotal moment. Would you say that's the most pivotal moment that shaped your career trajectory, or do you think because you're now literally doing a company called Everywhere Ventures, and you were talking about traveling everywhere and
Yeah.
investing in companies everywhere. I mean, is that the most pivotal, or is there something else that just like was the light bulb moment for you?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there was a moment, but I think, my years at Techstars were really interesting because while many of the managing directors, I mean, everyone basically, spent their budget how they wanted to spend it. I spent mine really traveling around the world, meeting different founders and community leaders and people in other ecosystems, not just like to better myself, but like I wanted access to those entrepreneurs. So one of the things that I got really good at was recruiting founders in global markets to come to New York to my program. And so I think over, just the years of doing that, feeling so comfortable of just showing up anywhere, I started to realize like, hey, there's a thesis around a fund here, right? If I can help connect global founders to resources that we have in the US, which is like really where my network is, like that could be, a huge benefit for them. And so I just was doing that organically for my work at Techstars and, realized like, hey, this is actually a fund. And so, although 70% of our investments are actually in companies in North America, that 30% are all over the world. And really one of the reasons they want us on the cap table is because of that connectivity to global markets, to global talent, to capital, all these things. So I'd say maybe it wasn't like one moment of like, you need to build a global fund. It was getting comfortable and developing relationships in these different places and, just feeling very embraced by it. In the book, I tell the story of landing in Mexico City, where Techstars didn't have an office, but it had a bunch of employees that were all working at the, part of the Startup Weekend community teams. And I mean, these people could not have been more generous, picked me up from the airport, took me to all these like restaurants and like, then they wanted me to go to meetings with them so that they could like, kind of tote me around a little bit. I met all the local founders and it was just so incredible to be embraced. And the benefit of that was for years to come after I started going to Mexico consistently, I would get, all these founders who wanted to move to the US or scale into the US, like they would find me and call me and connect with me. And so I was getting this incredible deal flow just from the fact that I went there. And spent time there and tried to get to know people on the ground, which, the truth is most venture capitalists, are not doing. So, one of the through lines, in my life and in the book is just like, push yourself to go places, to be open, and to experience things. And that will kind of come back in spades.
That's a great point, and it really speaks to the importance of in person embracing a place, as you kind of travel through time, I guess you could say. So I think it's really interesting. I mean, we did a lot of that with back in the day with Tech Cocktail, Tech Co, traveling all over, and have seen. I mean, we still have connections today that like I just saw some of them last week in Austin, at South by Southwest, and that was some of them I connected with 15 years ago. So definitely understand what you're saying there, and I think some people overlook that, especially these days with the Zoom. Zoom is easy, right? So
Yeah. But I remember you and I actually met in Las Vegas
right.
originally through that whole community. And like every period, every once in a while, someone from that era when, we were hanging out there, going to those events and like meeting those people will reach out and they'll be like, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but like I met you back. I mean, what year was that? 2010 maybe?
2012 to
Yeah.
2012 to 2015, 16, something like that.
Okay. So yeah, like 2012. And it's just, it's obviously hard to keep up all these networks, but I think when you have, these foundational experiences, especially in developing ecosystems, like what we saw on the ground that was being built there, was very impactful to us, right? And so, we just have these like strong memories of those, and it's, it's fun to kind of revisit that.
Definitely. And to that point, like we set up these little cohorts when we were doing the tech weeks there and bringing people to Las Vegas, and we set up group meets. And there's still some that are
That's
still active.
right.
I'm on them.
I remember
I feel
that.
bad. I don't want to remove myself. So
Right.
there's still chats going on between these little cohorts of people that
That's
met,
awesome.
over 12 years, 15 years. It's been a while.
Long live group me. I love
Yeah.
it.
Still chatting over there. All right, so we're about ready to wrap here. I wanted to make sure it's for those that are, from both the startup side and I guess even the LP side. So from like a startup side, you invest in what kind of companies, what are you looking for, and maybe share a little bit kind of like check size, that kind of things for all the startups who are listening, and they can obviously connect with you that way.
Yeah. So we do all pre-seed, and the way that we define that are small rounds, first institutional rounds. And so those are usually 500 to about 2 million. We write small collaborative checks with other investors. So we write 250. We're happy to lead or not lead. We invest only in software and we invest across many verticals, but I'd say the ones that we spend more time on are things like healthcare, fintech, climate, logistics, future of work. Yeah, those are some of the areas that we're interested in, all software based, and you can be anywhere.
Right, that's great. And then from an LP perspective, you basically have an approach where you work with founders, you said, but has that evolved over time? Are you looking for additional LPs? Is there some way that they can connect with you if you're looking for additional support as you raise more funds? I don't know what fund are we on now? Like what number are we at?
Fund three.
Yeah.
And yeah, we're always, talking to interesting people, raised mostly from founders and operators and some family offices that, are excited about our deal flow. So
Perfect. All right. And then finally, the book is venture everywhere. You can get it at pretty much everywhere, I think, right? Amazon. That's where I got mine. I don't know where other people can get it, but you get it online. There's a Kindle version. Are you doing an audiobook?
yes, it is coming soon. Yeah, I think we wanted to get the physical book out first, but it is coming.
Yeah. And actually, I did an audiobook for when I did a book, and it's actually harder than writing the book. So give yourself time. It does
Oh,
take.
did you record it?
Yes.
Oh yeah, I'm not recording mine.
Okay.
They asked me, they were like, they were very funny. They were like, "Do you want to audition for recording it?" I was like, "Audition?
For
No."
my book? Yeah,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
that's fine.
Honestly, it's such a personal story. I think that like I would get, I don't know, choked up, or I would just like I'd get so into it. I think it would be really hard.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is coming with someone else.
Okay. Great. So that's coming soon. And
Yeah.
then I guess last but not least, so you can get the book everywhere as well as your
Yeah.
website, jennyfielding.com, right? And then where can they, I guess, is that the best place to connect if they wanted to follow up with you?
Yeah, I have a website, so you can find a lot of information about me. Connect with me on LinkedIn, very active LinkedIn-er. And those are good places.
All right.
So
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny. Really appreciate it. We've got Jenny Fielding here today. Thanks for joining us. Her insights on global entrepreneurship, investing, and her everywhere mindset really, hopefully, you gathered something from it today. It was increasingly or incredibly valuable information for all those out there that are listening. And I remember, if you have a startup idea and you want to get it started, today's the best day to start up, not tomorrow, not the next day. Do what Jenny did. She got it started as a side hustle and then eventually evolved it into now investing in 300 companies. So congrats on all that success, Jenny. Really appreciate it. And for all those interested in joining our community, please do come to startupofyear.com and check out more details. Until next time, I'm Frank Gruber. Thanks for being here today, and I'm signing off.
thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Startup of the Year podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll be back with another episode soon.